Hi there. Today we're going to discuss a few things you should know when participating in a clinical study. A clinical study helps researchers determine whether a new treatment, such as a drug, device, or therapy, is effective and safe. Study results are often submitted for review by regulatory authorities like the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. All prescribed treatments must obtain regulatory approval, which requires results from clinical study participants like you. The next word we'll discuss is randomized. Randomized has a specific meaning in clinical trials. Randomization means that the intervention participants receive is assigned by a chance process, similar to a lottery. In studies like this one, some participants receive the experimental treatment, and some participants receive a placebo, an inactive substitute made to look like the experimental treatment. We'll explain placebos more in a moment. But when we say a study is randomized, what we mean is the assignment of individual subjects to a treatment group is random. In other words, no one, not you, your doctors, the clinicians, or the researchers, gets to decide whether you receive the experimental study product or the placebo. And not only is selection random, but who receives what treatment is not disclosed, at least until the study is completed. Some studies, when they're over, tell participants whether they received active treatment or placebo. Others don't. But in double-blind studies, this much is always true. For the course of the study, no one, not even you, knows which treatment you're receiving. The only exception to this is under true medical emergencies, where there is a process for emergency care providers to learn if you were given the experimental treatment. You might be wondering, why? Why give some participants an inactive placebo instead of the experimental study product? It's a great question, and brings us to that last phrase, placebo-controlled. Maybe you've heard of a placebo effect. It's a fascinating mind-body phenomenon. A person has a placebo effect when they experience benefits or adverse effects of a treatment they expected to receive, even though they haven't received that treatment. How is this possible? Well, science has shown us that various aspects of the clinical study process, from interaction with caring clinical practitioners to the hope that new treatment will work, can psychologically impact a participant to the point that they experience real improvement. Yes, even when they've been taking placebo. Consider a patient who I'll call Mrs. A. When Mrs. A's husband drove her to a screening visit for a treatment study, her symptoms were so intense they had to stop 4 times during the 12-mile drive. When they finally arrived, Mrs. A described the many treatments she had already tried with no success. For 3 years, she'd been unable to work, drive, or socialize with friends. Mrs. A qualified for the randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled study for an oral treatment. She began taking it as directed. When she returned for her follow-up appointment 1 week later, Mrs. A had great news. Her condition had improved. Her test results were similarly promising. They had improved by more than 80% since the start of the study. The next week, even more improvement. Mrs. A was seeing friends for the first time in years. She'd even driven to the appointment. By the end of the study, Mrs. A's symptoms had almost completely resolved. She and her husband were incredibly grateful for the miraculous treatment. There was only one catch. Mrs. A and her study team learned that she had received placebo, or inactive treatment, not the experimental product being studied. This is placebo effect, and it's important to note that Mrs. A is not alone. Other participants in the same study had also experienced positive outcomes, only to learn that they'd received placebo too. We share Mrs. A's story to underscore a scientific fact. It's very difficult in most cases to assess whether an experimental treatment product works without a comparison group, often referred to as a control group. This reality is why studies are placebo-controlled. By including a placebo group in studies, we control for possible mind-body responses that come from conditioned responses, hopes, expectations, and other beliefs or biases that can influence outcomes. At first, the idea of placebo can sound unsettling or even shocking. Remember, clinical studies are experiments. There's no promise that receiving the experimental study product, or even a known active treatment, is the best option. Clinical trial treatments only receive regulatory approval if they're shown to perform at least as well as an already available treatment or better than placebo, which is frequently not the case. Placebo and the experimental study product may turn out to be equally effective or even equally ineffective. Let's recap. Randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical studies randomly assign study participants to treatment with an experimental study product or a biologically inactive placebo. Randomization helps assure the treatment groups are balanced, even for factors we can't see, and double-blinding keeps bias at bay by keeping this drug assignment unknown. As a research subject, your participation is, of course, entirely voluntary, and you may withdraw from the study at any time. While you participate, the study will best be able to evaluate the experimental test product if you follow the protocol or directions and report your experience as accurately as possible. It's natural to hope you will get better. Making guesses about your treatment assignment is also natural. Am I receiving actual treatment or a placebo? However, it's important to note that such guesses are wrong about as often as they are right. So try not to dwell on what might seem like clues to whether or not you're receiving active treatment or placebo. Focus instead on your clinical condition and communicating it clearly with your team. As we saw with Mrs. A, feeling better doesn't necessarily mean you are receiving the experimental treatment. The same could be said for not getting better or a lack of side effects. These don't necessarily mean you're receiving placebo either. Finally, let's discuss your appointments, known in clinical studies as assessments. Although you may anticipate a visit similar to what you experience at your doctor's office, a research visit will generally take more time since the study assessments are more thorough than routine clinical assessments. Research professionals in this study are trained to ask questions, listen carefully to your responses, and use their best judgment to rate your symptoms as accurately as possible. It is important that you be as objective as possible when you describe your symptoms. If you think they've misunderstood anything you're reporting, feel free to correct them. Like you, they do not know your treatment assignment. Moreover, studies have shown that their guesses are no more likely to be correct than yours. To recap, the goal of the study protocol is to increase medical knowledge by comparing the experiences for participants assigned to placebo to the experiences for participants assigned to the experimental treatment. If you participate, you might receive a placebo, which is a biologically inactive agent, or the experimental treatment. Whether you receive treatment with the experimental study product or placebo, there's a chance you'll experience benefits and/or adverse effects due to mind-body effects, rather than effects associated with the experimental treatment. Such positive and negative placebo effects are seen in every study. You understand that your treatment assignment is made randomly, not by the investigator. It is outside of your control and ours, too. Since the study is carried out under double-blind conditions, neither you nor the study staff know your treatment assignment during the study. Only in some studies do you find out after the study ends. You have also learned that your response to treatment, positive or negative, is not necessarily a reliable clue as to whether you received placebo or active treatment. Try not to overthink it. The value of your participation in the clinical study is your ability to follow protocol and report results. There are no right or wrong answers. Whether you get better, get worse, or experience no change, your job as a participant is simply to report your own experiences as accurately as you can. By reporting her unbiased experiences under blinded conditions, subjects like Mrs. A helped researchers determine that the experimental treatment was actually no better than placebo treatment and did not merit approval. Finally, we encourage you to ask questions anytime about anything and report any changes you experience, including side effects and no effects. We've covered a lot of material. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I hope you find it useful and wish you all the best with your health and all that lies ahead.